first childhood memory was this out-of-body experience. I was looking down on myself, and all these people are just running around, and they're spraying me with stuff, and there's emergency responders, and my mom and my grandma, and there's just chaos going on.
Wholeness.Legacy podcast.
Hello, my name is Margarita Kulaga. I'm the founder of Wholeness.Legacy. Welcome to my podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be diving into what is trauma and who is impacted by it. I'm always with a drink and a mug. So today I have my M mug for Margarita or Mom, and I'm drinking some hot tea today. First, let's start with the definition of what is trauma. Trauma is a very big and very complex topic, and so we're not going to be able to get into all the details of all that it entails, but let's start with a definition that is palatable. I like to think of trauma as a response. Notice how I said response, not an event. It is a response to something bad that happened, or a response to something good that did not happen. And we'll dive into that. Trauma is not what happens to you, but it is what happens inside of you. And so this is why when, say, a car accident happens and you have 3 different witnesses, and those 3 different witnesses give a slightly different testimony of what happened, because we experience our world not by facts, but actually by feelings of how we perceive things to be, how we felt about things as they were happening. And so this is why a lot of times our accounts are not factual of the things that have happened to us. And that's not wrong. That is called your truth. And your truth is not the big T truth. It's just your truth. It's your perception of what happened. And it's the beliefs that you formed as a result of the events that happened. And so I want to talk about 3 different types of trauma. Now, trauma is classified in many, many different categories, but I'm going to categorize them into 3 different ones that we'll talk about. The first one is acute trauma. Acute trauma is when one thing happens. It's a standalone trauma. So it's one big event. Like I mentioned earlier, an example is a traumatic car accident, and it happened one time. So the other type of trauma is chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is something bad that is seen that continues to happen. So the easiest example of this is, it's not the easiest, but an example of this is abuse, an ongoing abuse in a household, in a school, wherever it may be, but it's something bad, something physical that happens that is ongoing. The other type of trauma, and I'm going to classify this part of trauma into many different types, and I will call it all complex trauma. Complex trauma will cover the main topic for today, and it is the trauma of something good that didn't happen. Something that is unseen that is happening. That sounds very contradictory. Let me explain myself. It is when a child does not have his or her needs met emotionally. So we talked about earlier that there's physical needs and there's emotional needs. And emotional needs are oftentimes it's not measurable, it's not seen. Physical needs, if there's an absence of a physical need, you can see that. And both of those are essential. I like this quote. I don't know who it's by, but it goes, what is essential is invisible. And that summarizes those unmet needs. Though they are essential, they're invisible. And that is the type of trauma that impacts, I would say, about 80% of everyone. And that is a very conservative number. All the trauma, everything you're experiencing, maybe it's PTSD, maybe it's symptoms of trauma, those are all things that have happened in the past, but you're feeling the effects of what happened in the past in the present moment. And so we want to get to the root of how it happens and what the effects of it are today in your life. So what happens when your physical needs are not met? Your brain goes into survival mode. And I feel like most people know in survival mode, you fight, flight, freeze, or the other one that's not most talked about often is you fawn. And so it's the same brain response that happens inside of us when our emotional needs are not met as children. We are hardwired for connection. And when we are born, we're looking for someone who is looking for us. And if we don't get that someone who's looking back at us, who's wanting us, who is desiring us, who is awaiting our presence, then we form unhealthy attachments. Our cortisol level goes up, and that puts us into survival mode. And what happens in your brain when you're in survival mode, I will tell you in very elementary words. I'm not going to use any big words. I'm just going to make it very palatable. You have the upstairs brain, which is your thinking brain, your reasoning brain, your self-control brain. It's also called the adult brain because you can critically think, you can reason, you can respond, you can control your emotions. And then we have the downstairs brain, which is also called the child brain or the lizard brain because it functions on survival. And between these two brains, you have a bridge that connects. And so what happens when you're in survival mode, an event that has happened to you, your survival brain takes over and it starts communicating with your upstairs brain, your adult brain. And if you're in the best case scenario, a healthy human, then there's that connection point and it communicates. It sends the signal to your upstairs brain and it tells your upstairs brain, hey, this is what's happening. You're on alert. And then you are able to think about what is happening and come up with a solution. Physically speaking, we need that survival brain because if you see a lion, you want to run. You don't want to think about it. And we are actually programmed as children to do the same when we're in traumatic situations emotionally. And so when a child is in survival mode because of complex trauma, the needs being unmet, your cortisol level's always high, your brain's always on alert. And what happens is that bridge that is not very strong to begin with, because when you're a little child, the first part of your brain that forms is that child brain. That's why we call it that child brain. It's the survival brain. That's the first part of your brain that forms. And later, as you learn things, as you sponge, you're a little sponge when you're a little child, you start making connections, you start forming that adult brain. And then there's that connection point between the survival brain and the adult brain. And what happens when you're constantly in survival mode is, depending on how bad that trauma is, your bridge may be underdeveloped, or it can be weakened. And if this is ongoing and ongoing, then your bridge from your downstairs brain to your upstairs brain can be completely immobilized, which means that you're just living out of survival mode. That is your only mode. And so survival mode is, those survival instincts. When there is something bad, you fight, you run, you freeze, or you fawn. And as a little child, you cannot fight because you're depending on these people to take care of you. And you cannot run, again, because you're dependent on these people that take care of you. So what happens is you freeze, or you fawn, or you do a combination. Freezing looks like going inside of yourself. It is detaching emotionally from the adults that you depend on. You can't run from them, and you can't fight them, so you detach from them. And when you fawn, you start almost overcompensating. You start doing things to get that feeling of I matter. So when you freeze, it's a feeling of I don't matter. When you fawn, it's a feeling of if I take care of your needs, then I matter. And so sometimes for me, I had a combination of both of those things, the freezing and the fawning. So your brain begins to code as you are born, even in your utero, the brain begins to code things about you. It takes everything that is experienced and it begins to form belief systems. And under trauma, complex trauma, you begin to form a belief system about you that is based on lies about you. And this is why when we are little children, we are not able to look at the situation and say, oh, well, this is not my fault. This is my parents' fault who's treating me this way. We don't have the skills or the intellect to form those opinions about ourselves. We can only go off of our experience. And for that whole survival mode that we just talked about, the brain won't allow you for survival to fault the caretakers. Because if it faults the caretakers, then you are not able to survive. This is what you perceive as a newborn. And so the only other choice is to look inward, to put the blame on yourself. And this is when shame enters your life. I like to think of trauma as shame, because the complex trauma, the needs unmet, you turn it back on yourself and you say, I must not be good. And that is what is coded in your brain early on. And we form these negative attachments based on the belief system of what trauma has taught us. It could look like in your relationships being overly dependent on people, being insecure, being anxiously attached is what it's called, where you are doing everything you can to make that person love you, to form a connection. And it looks like needing lots of reassurance, being insecure about everything that is said, that is done, overthinking. The other extreme of that is the freeze, where you get extremely independent, where you're not able to receive love because you've closed off from connection, because connection's not safe. And so you end up not being able to fully attach. So those are some of the effects that we can see as adults from trauma that's happened in the past. But trauma doesn't only impact us emotionally. It is actually stored in our body. It impacts our belief system of what we perceive ourselves to be. It impacts how we relate to the world. It impacts us in our bodies. It is actually stored in our brain, in our hearts, in our gut, and often comes out in a form of illnesses, sleeplessness, poor diet, not poor diet meaning you're unhealthy, meaning loss of appetite, chronic pain, headaches. And this is that cortisol that's always spiked if you're living out of that survival mode. And so not only does it impact our body in that way, it is also stored in our nervous system. And so we're always on this like high alert, and we can feel that in our bodies. Oftentimes women feel it in their gut or stomach, I should say, and men feel it in their chest. And so when the reactions happened, we are unable to control. We don't have that self-control response because that bridge is not strong enough or is completely broken. And so we react out of that survival mode. And that looks different. You know, when you're an adult, you can start getting angry and defensive and offensive. And all sorts of emotions rise up that you're unable to control in the moment when you're triggered. And so whenever you're triggered, so if you're having a argument with your spouse and all of a sudden you have this big emotion and this big reaction that you cannot control, that is not the present. That is past trauma showing up in the present through whatever the trigger is. And so those are some of the effects of trauma in our lives. So when I ask the question of who is affected by this, honestly, I would say everyone to some degree. And so I can actually sum up all of the things that we just talked about, all of this trauma in one mindset, and it's called the orphan mindset. Out of the orphan mindset is needs unmet, those emotional needs that we talked about. It puts you into this orphan mindset and creates all of the things we just talked about because you feel like you don't have a parent, a caretaker who can take care of you well. And so you turn it on yourself. I'm not good. And part of the healing takes place when you realize that you do have a caretaker. You have a father who's good and who's loving. And it's not your earthly father. You guys, we cannot fault our parents because our parents did the best they could with the tools they had. They didn't have an awareness of all of this. And they did what they've learned, and they tried to do better. You guys, they tried. Most parents have really good intentions. And so they try hard to love you the best that they're able. But you cannot give someone what you don't have. And that applies to how you parent, to how you love, to how you relate to people. So if you don't have those skills, you can't give those away. You can't function in them with other people. I would like to share examples of some of these different types of trauma from my life. And then, you guys, I'm going to give you some good news. So stay tuned. The acute trauma, you know, that one single event. An example from my life is when I was little, my first childhood memory was this out-of-body experience. I was looking down on myself, and all these people are just running around, and they're spraying me with stuff, and there's emergency responders and my mom and my grandma, and there's just chaos going on. And I'm on the table and people are just around me trying to figure out what to do. Because what had happened is when I was very little, I want to say maybe 3, we in our household had this big pot container of boiling water that we poured ourselves tea from. And I was standing directly in front of this container when my brother had tried to pour me some tea. And this whole container just slipped and covered me, covered at least 50% of my body. And I remember looking down at myself, and there's first responders who were pulling clothes that were melted to my skin. And that's all I remember. I went to the hospital and I was there for months. And if you guys know anything about the Slavic hospital, specifically back, 40 years ago, you weren't allowed to have parents there or relatives or anybody close to you. And the people there were not nurturing. They were not kind. They didn't care. They literally didn't care. And oftentimes they made fun of you for having pain. They poked at you for crying. And that is the experience that I had as a little child. The other form of trauma, the chronic trauma I will talk about, is the abuse of harsh punishment. And again, we are taught as Christian families to, spank your children. The famous Bible verse, spare the rod and spoil the child. And that type of upbringing is very harmful to a little child who's depending on these adults to take care of them. And then they are disciplining that child without the understanding of how harmful that is and how it could be done differently. And so this is kind of a touchy topic, I understand. And if you're a parent and that's what you're set on, I want to tell you this. If your child disobeys you, doesn't listen to you, and you want to go discipline them, spank them, however you want to call it, I want you to stop and ask yourself, are you annoyed? Are you angry? Are you frustrated, stressed? If so, please stop and give yourself some time to calm down your nervous system before you go in and do the spanking or the discipline or however you want to call it. And I can have a whole podcast on this, and I will in the future. And I'm coming from a place of also having that belief system and trying to do better. Whenever your gut feeling tells you to do something or not to do something, I highly encourage you to listen to that and question that and be curious about that, because it is your body talking to you. And for parents, I just encourage you to do your own research, dive in and really understand for yourself what it means to withhold a rod and spoil your child. What does that actually mean? To do your own study and stop believing what others tell you to do based on their interpretation of the Bible. And that's my little rant. I'm off my soapbox, get back to the topic, but this is one of the forms of chronic trauma that I have experienced. Again, people do what they know how to do, and they can't give you more than what they have. And the other type of trauma I've talked a lot about in my story, my first podcast, and you can go ahead and go listen to that. But yes, I grew up with needs that were unmet. One of the things I always told people or felt is that I felt invisible. And that is a symptom of a child who froze in the circumstance of trauma. And now, you guys, for some good news. The good news is trauma, defined by a dictionary, is a deep wound. It's a wound, which means that it can be healed. And that's the good news. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what you can do to just begin that process. All trauma can be healed. And I want to focus specifically on the mindset. The most powerful way of healing is healing from the core of our identity, is figuring out whose you are, who your father is, who your creator is, where you came from, not from your parents, but where did humanity originally start? You need to figure that out because that relates to who you are today. And you cannot fully know who you are until you deal with that question of where do I come from? Whose am I? And that will determine your mentality. Because trauma is a false belief of your identity, we need to go back and see who our Father is and question His goodness and find out how we relate to that before we can begin to look at your family system. So I want to say to you, if you believe in God, but you do not believe in the goodness of God, go on that journey, explore, really sit with God, and don't be scared to ask Him the hard questions. He can handle it. He can handle it all. And begin there. And if you want to know what trauma looks like in your life, I encourage you to just start being curious and start being kindly curious, is what I should say. Because when you have a reaction, you want to be curious. Why did I have a reaction? Instead of like, dang it, I blew it again. I'm blah, 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 blah. Start being curious kindly when you have a reaction to something, when you blow up and you can't control yourself. After the fact, you process, you start getting curious. Why did that happen? Where in my body did I feel it? What made me react that way? And you start being curious about the habits that you have, the way that you react to things, the relationships that you have, the problems in your relationships, how you receive love, how you give love, how you connect with people. Notice even how your body feels. What do you feel about your body? Because oftentimes we disengage with our body when we're in a high stressful situation and we can't fight and we can't flight. We disengage with our body. That's what happened on an extreme level to me with the experience I shared of that acute trauma. I extremely disengaged, and that was survival. And it served a purpose. Oftentimes, a lot of us, we disengage with our bodies without even knowing we're doing that. It's subconscious. So ask yourself, how do you feel about your body? Are there places where you store stress? You just need to start getting curious of why you do the things you do and how you feel. And emotions, they're super important because emotions actually bridge the gap from survival mode to adult mode brain, from the downstairs brain to the upstairs brain. And emotions, they give us like a diagnosis. So when your survival mode is on alert and it's saying, hey, you're in danger, you're feeling really sad, that emotion diagnoses you so now that you can fix the problem. But if you ignore the emotions, if you ignore the feelings, then it's harder for your brain to connect and diagnose and really collaborate together to get you to the feeling of safety. So my challenge to you is to begin to be kindly curious, to begin to ask these questions to yourself in love. I want you to hear me. The things that have happened to you are not a result of anything you did or anything that you are or are not. You are worth it. You are valuable. You are lovable. You are fun. You are a joy to be around. You've got so many amazing skills and talents and giftings, and I cannot wait for you to heal and discover all that life has to offer you.